Brian, let's talk about something that I think a lot of people do not understand, and I know that you can shed some light on this, and this is the AB Credit Shelter Trust. What is that?
Yeah, it goes by a lot of different names. I've heard it called the AB Trust, Credit Shelter Trust, Credit Exemption Trust, lots of different names. Basically, the purpose of this is to get not pay as much of estate tax on the value of your assets when you pass away. So there have been times in history, especially recently, where the federal estate tax exemption amount is really high, and you wouldn't really have to worry about having these trusts in your will because no one's going to pay any federal estate tax. But your state that you live in may not follow those same rules. They may have a much lower exemption amount like they do in the state of Washington where I am here. Much lower exemption amount, so it affects a lot more people. But it's good to potentially have this in your will just in case, they can change this. It's a moving target all the time. Change the federal exemption amount of estate taxes and how much is excluded. And so you can have these provisions in there that says if the federal estate or state estate tax comes into play, then a separate trust is going to be set up so that money can go into there without any federal or state estate tax.
So does this vary greatly state by state?
It does vary greatly state by state. State of Washington, it's a little over $2 million exemption, whereas the state next to us, it could be $11 million or whatever the current federal estate tax exemption is. So yes, it varies state by state.
So depending upon what state you're in, you may be better off to die in one state versus another state, it sounds like.
Yeah, I've actually had a lot of clients in Washington state that have maybe they have, between the two of them, husband and wife, they've got $10 million of assets, and they say, well, we can get out of $6 million of federal or state estate tax. We move to one of those other states. And so I've seen them actually move for that reason because they're getting on in years, and they say, well, I don't want to pay 7 figures of tax on the value of my assets to the state of Washington just because I'm enjoying the rain here. I'll just move someplace a little drier for my last years and get out of that tax. So I've seen people even do that. But certainly if your estate is higher, it's very important to take advantage of this, because if you don't have these provisions in your will or living trust, it could cost your estate hundreds of thousands or many millions of dollars.
Brian, how does this vary according to your marital status?
Yeah, so there's an estate tax exemption, but that's an individual exemption. Now, if let's say that we have a husband and wife, and they've got a $20 million estate, and at the time the federal exemption was $11 million. Well, if one of them dies and leaves their half of their estate to the surviving spouse, then the surviving spouse now has $20 million, and $9 million of that will be taxed at roughly half of it will be taxed upon their death, over $4 million of federal estate tax. Had they just had a provision in their will, when the first person died, half of the estate would have gone into trust, and then she would have $10 million. The trust would have $10 million when she died. Instead of $4.5 million or $4 million of federal estate tax being owed, there'd be zero, because both were under the exemption at that time. So it can be a very, very powerful tool just to have this provision, depending on whether you have a bigger estate or not.
Can you give me an example of a client who has used this Credit Shelter Trust?
Yeah, the example I would use, I just had a high net worth person, but let's just say somebody, husband and wife, have $1 million house. They each have $1 million in their 401k plans, and they have $1 million of other investments. So, that's a fairly common case for a financial advisor to run into. If they had this then in place in the state of Washington, if they did not have the Credit Shelter Trust provision or AB trust provisions in their will, when they passed away, that $4 million of assets is well above the roughly $2 million that's exempt from tax. And so by having this in their wills, then they each got the $2+ million exemption, and there would be no tax. So they would be able to leave an extra $400,000 to $500,000 to their heirs, again, just by having a properly drafted will or living trust.
Brian, thanks for telling us more about the AB Credit Shelter Trust.